Hello, I'm Sanna, this is Filtrit, and today I'm interested in Birch-bark letter number 292. So the topic for this video is not really Finnish under any sensible definition of the word. So this video is more Finnic rather than Finnish. And the focus is on Novgorod, medieval Novgorod, which was an important center for trade connecting the Baltic and Constantinople. And what's really interesting about Novgorod is that it is an absolute gold mine for archaeologists. The soil in Novgorod is very, very damp. And paradoxically, that means that a lot of organic material has survived and has been preserved really well over centuries. And so from those finds, we have a lot of information about how people lived in the medieval period in Novgorod. Another really interesting thing about Novgorod is that the layers of earth can be dated really accurately. So there is really this breadth and quite literal depth of material that helps us understand those lives, because there have been discoveries like shoes and toys. So we get a sense of how people lived and played, and to a degree the kinds of conversations they had. Because the particular type of finding in Novgorod that I find most interesting are the Birch-bark letters, which are largely exactly what it says on the tin, what it sounds like. They are strips of birch bark that have notes and messages scribbled onto them. And these tend to be quite sort of short or curt messages. So, send a horse, I forgot my shirt, marry me, be my wife. And look, these were typically or probably sent by messengers. So there's a whole other level of communication happening around the letter. So they're not necessarily standalone messages as such. But it's a really interesting insight into the fact that there was this level of popular literacy, because the messages that are being sent around are quite banal, and the material itself is obviously cheap. It literally grows on trees. These aren't important official documents and expensive parchments. Now, before I go into Birch-bark letter 292 specifically, I do want to add a couple of caveats into this idea of popular literacy, because we do want to be careful that we don't overcorrect and then assume that, okay, because of these letters, it must mean that everyone had this high level of literacy. It's possible, but the letters themselves aren't necessarily evidence of that, because we do know that there were scribes and messengers working in Novgorod. So the fact that someone is sending or receiving a written message doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves know how to read or write. The caveat to the caveat is that just because you use a scribe or messenger doesn't mean that you don't know how to do that yourself, but you're choosing to do that in the moment. I know how to make pizzas, but quite often I will ask someone else to do that for me. And if you were just looking at my credit card statement, you'd have no idea. So similar kinds of things we can assume about communication itself, but not overextend that. What is also notable in the discoveries in Novgorod is that there are various everyday items like fishing equipment and plates and bowls that have people's names inscribed on them. So although those aren't letters in themselves, but they do show that people recognized the practical purpose of the written word. And regardless of the level of personal literacy, there was that understanding and appreciation of the written word in medieval Novgorod. And that then brings me to the specific letter 292. And this is particularly interesting for a couple of different reasons. It was discovered in 1957 on Bibliography Street on the west bank of the Volkhov River. And I'm going to put a map here about that shows exactly where in Novgorod it was found. Not because the location itself is essential for the topic itself, but it's interesting. And if I am going to stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning trawling through 1960s archaeological journals, I am going to use the information I find. The the reason why Birch-bark letter 292 is particularly interesting is that it is one of only a handful of the Birch-bark letters that was written in a language other than Old East Slavic. So it's written in Cyrillic, but not in a Slavic language. And it is the only one of any length in a balto-finnic language. And is in fact the earliest written attestation of a balto-finnic language by about a margin of 300 years. So it's really unique in that respect. Now, we know sort of roughly some of the meaning of it, but not entirely. And the reason for that, one of the reasons is that there are lots of different ways to transliterate the text itself. And I'll show a few different options here that have been developed over the last 70 odd years since its discovery. And part of the challenge comes down to not being clear where the boundaries between words are, so where the spaces need to go. And there are some specific characters that can cause some difficulties as well. If you look at the first line of the transliterations, as a contemporary Finnish speaker, there are potentially a couple of words that you might be able to pick out, like Jumalan nuoli, God's arrow, and nimisi, which would be something along the lines of your name. And if we interpret some of those words in that way, that would align with a interpretation from Yelisev in the late 50s, early 60s, who saw these three lines as an attempt to name or give the 10 names of lightning, and then interpreting it as a sort of curse and an attempt to control weather and lightning. And that's what makes this particular letter interesting in that second sense, which is that it has that mystical element to it, which is quite far removed from the majority of the other letters, which, as I mentioned, are more about those banal factors of life, to the extent that marriages are banal, but trade and taxes and homework and so on. So this is quite different, and certainly going by that theory of trying to control weather itself. There's another interpretation by Martti Haavio a little bit later, who sees it as an oath form where the speaker promises to be punished if they don't hold to their promise. More recently, Willem Vermeer has a theory that it's actually about pain. So, and he refers to the idea of arrows as representing illness or pain. And in Finnish these days we have noidan nuoli, which is the witch's arrow, meaning sort of acute back pain. So there's something quite relatable about that interpretation, certainly. And there's a sense of that incantation and a protection, something to ward off pain itself. So we've got those kinds of quite different interpretations that arise out of those different interpretations of specific symbols and letters in that text. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail now. So, for example, does this symbol here stand for the vowel sound I, or is it shorthand for the number 10? Does this one here represent H, K, or a slightly wonky U? And is this the diphthong U, or is it a mirroring of these two characters, possibly pronounced as the monophthong U? Could they also have stood for a range of different vowel sounds, keeping in mind that a writing system designed for a Slavic language may not be able to accurately capture the sounds of a different language family entirely? Also, given the lettering itself is on the messy side, it is possible that the scribe taking down the message did not themselves speak the language. So the spelling may also not be entirely faithful to the intended meaning. So again, all of the interpretations of the letter come with different caveats and exceptions. In her article in 1999, Johanna Laakso argues that there just isn't enough linguistic evidence to make any definitive judgments about the letter and its specific meaning, and that any sort of breakthroughs and definitive answers would depend on the input of folklorists. So, for example, if there is evidence of lightning having 10 names among the balto-finnic people round about the same time, then Yelisev's theory about it being a attempt to control storms and thunder suddenly gains a lot more weight. So We don't know exactly what it's about. We know there's possibly something a little bit mystical associated with it, and it certainly has that really significant role as being that early attestation of a balto-finnic language. I like the fact that there's a little bit of room for interpretation about what it could be. I personally quite like the idea of someone known in the neighborhood as being a good source of spells being asked to provide effectively a prescription against pain. And so it would be an early example of the folk healing by correspondence. You know, if we consider that the letters look a little bit higgledy-piggledy, maybe the person tried to get rid of this as quickly as possible. Maybe the letter was written by very poor light, and so you can't necessarily see exactly what you're writing down, because medieval Novgorod wasn't burdened with an excess of indoor lighting. There are a couple of questions that keep coming to me about this particular letter, and one is, why is it so unique? So why is it the only one of any length from not just a balto-finnic language, but any language other than Old East Slavic? So there's only a handful of these kinds of letters that were written in different languages, and so I find that quite strange, because even if you sort of think of, again, whether it's anachronistic to think about language groups and ethnic groups in the same way as we would today, but if there were different forms of communication preferred by particular language groups, and maybe it was primarily only the Slavic speakers who used this kind of method normally, it doesn't really make sense to me that those kind of divisions would have remained consistent over centuries. Even a full millennium, because the material discovered in Novgorod goes back a very, very long way. And then again, given it's so unique in terms of the mystical aspect of it. Now, I'm very fond of caveats. So the other caveat that comes into this is that there is still an estimated 20,000 or so Birch-bark letters that haven't been discovered in Novgorod yet. So it could be that over time there are more letters like this discovered from multilingual sorcerers and healers in the area. So it's entirely possible that letter 292 turns out to be representative of a particular genre of Birch-bark letter. If this is something you are interested in doing some further research in, there are a couple of keywords that you might want to start off with, and those are gramota and gramoti and berestology, which derive from the Russian words for these specific letters and their study. And you will also have quite a wild time going from looking at those different transliterations, also of names of the people involved in these digs and publications. So if you're looking to cross-reference between bibliographies and look for specific authors, be aware that the spellings might vary quite significantly, because there are a lot of things that will change and bring additional complexity when you're going from one writing system to another. So that's Birch-bark letter 292. Thank you very much for joining me. Maybe about to get rained on.